History often hides its most disturbing truths behind ceremony and polished marble. But the final years of Henry VIII cannot be softened or beautified. They must be told as they were: raw, foul, and unbearable. The king who once seduced Europe into bending before him ended his life as a creature no wife, mistress, or even servant could bear to approach. His decline was so ghastly that even his physicians tried to bury the records of what they witnessed. This is not a tale of courtly scandal. This is the story of a body devouring itself from the inside. After ordering the execution of his young wife, Katherine Howard, in 1542, the king who once filled his chambers with eager mistresses was abandoned completely. For 5 long years, Henry VIII died a little more each day, surrounded not by affection, but by the stench of rotting flesh. His legs were wrapped in thick bandages that seeped constantly. The ulcers beneath pulsated with infection, so powerful that servants gagged when they approached. Those who stood 3 rooms away could still catch the sour, sickening odor that clung to him like a curse. The beginning of this nightmare, however, was marked by Katherine's doomed journey to the Tower. On February 10th, 1542, the royal barge drifted beneath London Bridge. Katherine, barely more than a girl, forced herself to stare straight ahead, but her eyes rose of their own accord. Above her, black against the bleak winter sky, the heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham stared down, empty-eyed, ravens tugging at what remained of them. Katherine knew she would soon join them. Within days, her own head would be spiked upon the same grisly display. The Tower of London consumed her through Traitor's Gate, just as it had swallowed her cousin and Boleyn years earlier. The cold stones accepted her with the same silent hunger as every doomed soul before her. No one knew her exact age, 17, perhaps 18, but everyone understood one thing: she would not live long enough to see 19. Her last night stretched endlessly. The queen could not be executed on a Sunday, and so she waited until something inside her fractured. Guards heard strange movements, soft thuds, counting under her breath. Peering inside, they saw a sight that chilled them. Katherine was kneeling over a wooden chest, practicing the position she would hold for the executioner. She adjusted her neck, corrected her posture, rehearsed her own death with trembling precision. She feared the axe might miss and carve into her jaw or shoulder. She feared she might scream or flail. So she prepared, as though for a final performance. On the morning of February 13th, the executioner sharpened his blade while Katherine dressed in black velvet. Her hands shook too violently to fasten her gown. The guards had to carry her when her knees buckled beneath her. Tower Green, already darkened by Boleyn's blood, awaited her. A small group of nobles shivered in the cold air as she climbed the scaffold with their help. Her voice barely carried as she admitted her guilt, declared her sentence just, and asked that they pray for the king who condemned her. Henry was not present. He preferred not to witness the consequences of his commands. Katherine knelt. She placed her neck exactly as she had practiced. One breath later, the axe fell. Her head rolled. The blood spread slowly across the wooden boards. Lady Rochford stepped forward next, kneeling in the warmth of Katherine's final stain. But long before Katherine's young life ended, Henry VIII had already become a man ruled by appetite more than reason. For 3 decades, he moved through the women of his court as a hunter moves through prey, tireless, possessive, insatiable. Bessie Blunt, barely 15, became his mistress while Katherine of Aragon prayed alone. Mary Boleyn held his attention for a time, until her sharper, more dangerous sister entered the king's line of sight and refused to be anything less than queen. Henry tore England from Rome for Anne's sake, only to tire of her before the dust settled on her coronation crown. Jane Seymour replaced her even before and reached her executioner's block. Henry desired. He took. He discarded. Court ladies learned this rhythm like a deadly dance. The ambitious allowed themselves to be noticed. The wise kept their distance. Yet after Catherine Howard's death, something unthinkable happened. Henry stopped, completely. His bedchamber, once a revolving door of women and whispered promises, became silent. No new favorite, no late-night visits, no gifts sent in secret. At first, the court believed grief had finally broken him. But grief does not rot flesh. His temper grew monstrous. Servants trembled. Trusted men were banished without reason. The king seemed to be fighting an enemy no one else could see. And beneath his rage, his body collapsed. His once imposing frame ballooned. His features distorted. His legs oozed pus and blood through layers of fabric. The French ambassador described an odor so foul it clung to the walls long after the king left a room. Henry VIII, once the embodiment of virility, became something people recoiled from. 16 months passed without a single mistress. Chroniclers who documented every feast, every ceremony, found no trace of romantic intrigue. Foreign dignitaries sent portraits of eligible women. Henry barely glanced at them. His body demanded all his strength simply to function. Desire had been replaced by decay. But Henry's transformation had begun years earlier, on a cold January day in 1536, during a jousting tournament he should never have attempted. At 44, overweight and stubborn, he insisted on proving he was still the warrior he once had been. His horse stumbled. The beast crashed down on him. The weight of both king and animal smashed into the frozen earth. The court watched in horror as Henry was crushed beneath his own warhorse. Metal groaned. Bones snapped. When they dragged him free, he was unconscious, his left leg shattered, his brain injured in ways no one then understood. When he woke, he was changed. His temper grew unpredictable, vicious. His memory faltered. But worst of all, his leg wounds never healed. They closed, reopened, festered, and slowly poisoned him for the rest of his life. By the time Catherine Howard lost her head, Henry was already on the path toward his own slow, putrid end. The king who once held the world in awe now found himself alone, not from grief, but because no woman, no matter how ambitious or foolish, could bear to share a bed with a man who smelled of death. The wounds never closed. Not truly. Not ever. After 1536, Henry VIII's legs ceased to be limbs and became prisons of swollen flesh, cages where infection festered, deepened, and refused every attempt at healing. Today, doctors would instantly recognize the condition. Chronic venous ulcers made catastrophic by trauma, obesity, and failing circulation. But Tudor physicians had no such language. To them, the king wasn't ill. He was rotting, slowly, visibly, inch by inch from the legs upward. The ulcers first appeared as dark, cratered pits carved into the calves of England's most powerful man. Each wound was roughly the size of clenched fist. The edges swelled into angry red ridges that leaked continuously. But the centers were worse, a dead landscape of blackened flesh that stubbornly refused to detach. Beneath the surface, tunnels burrowed toward bone, forming shadowed pockets where infection thrived in the warm, airless depths. His physicians faced a horrifying dilemma. If the wounds ever closed completely, the trap infection would surge into Henry's bloodstream and kill him in days. But if they kept the ulcers open, if they forced the flesh to stay raw and draining, the king would suffer endlessly. They chose the slower death. They chose agony. Treatment was a ritual of torment, even by Tudor standards. Several times a week, and daily during the worst flare-ups, the king's doctors inserted thin metal rods, called setons, deep into the ulcers. These were not smooth instruments of healing. They were grooved to scrape away rotted tissue, to tear open new channels for the pus to escape. The physician would probe the wound, searching for hidden pockets, then drive the seton through living flesh until it emerged from another point in the leg. Henry's screams reverberated through Hampton Court. Servants on distant floors paused at the sound of their king's voice cracking under pain. No anesthetic existed. A few cups of wine dulled nothing. Henry bit down on thick leather straps. Over time, his teeth scarred and tore the material, forcing his attendants to replace it monthly. After each brutal session, the physicians packed the wounds with mixtures they hoped might help: honey and herbs, egg-white poultices laced with lead, bandages soaked in turpentine and wine. None of it worked for long. Within hours, the cloths oozed with yellow-green discharge that carried a stench potent enough to make hardened servants retch. Some begged for reassignment, accepting punishment instead of facing the king's diseased legs again. Worst of all was the unpredictability. An ulcer might show signs of improvement, edges tightening, drainage slowing, only to erupt overnight, soaking bed linens in blood and pus. The king's hope rose and crashed like a tide of misery. By 1542, the year he condemned Catherine Howard, both legs were failing. Walking unaided was impossible. Standing caused unbearable pressure. Kneeling, dancing, riding, everything that once fueled his pride became distant memories. And intimacy? Impossible. No lover could endure the fetid air that surrounded him. The royal armor's records reveal brutally objective proof of Henry's transformation. Each suit of armor, crafted precisely to the king's measurements, told a story of decline. 1,524. Waist 32 inches, chest 42. The proportions of an athlete, of a man who could joust until dusk, hunt all day, and dance all night. 1,536. After the jousting accident, waist 38, chest 45. Still formidable, but the armor noted difficulty fitting him. Henry shifted constantly, unable to bear weight on his damaged legs. 1,540. Waist 44, chest 49. Reinforced plates became necessary. The king's swelling flesh pushed outward. Thicker steel was required to contain him, which only added weight and worsened the burden on his deteriorating legs. 1,544. Waist 52, chest 53. The final suit was more engineering project than armor, designed for the king to sit in. Walking in it was unthinkable, yet measurements revealed only circumference. They did not capture the horror of Henry's appearance. His once handsome face ballooned into a swollen moon, skin stretched taut and shiny. Deep folds swallowed his once sharp jawline. His neck disappeared entirely. His calves, where muscle had once coiled like springs, resembled decaying tree trunks wrapped in stained bandages. His fingers swelled until they resembled splitting sausages. Rings became trapped, swallowed by flesh. His weight soared past 300 pounds. Some chroniclers whispered 350, others nearer 400 by his final winter. Exact numbers mattered less than the truth. Henry VIII had become too massive to move, too diseased to touch, too grotesque for desire. And then there was the smell. The scent of rot, the biological warning that signals death, clung to him constantly. The Venetian ambassador, normally composed to the point of arrogance, wrote a letter describing a council meeting. Before Henry entered, his presence announced itself through a wave of foul air that swept the chamber. The ambassador said it reminded him of battlefields left untouched for days. He excused himself twice to vomit. Physicians burned frankincense and myrrh until the chambers resembled cathedrals. They scattered rose petals on the floors. They soaked bandages in perfumes from Arabia. Nothing stopped the stench. Staff opened windows even in the dead of winter, their breath turning to mist as they stood shivering. Incense bearers walked ahead of the king like a morbid honor guard. Even from a distance, people recoiled, an unconscious flinch, a subtle step back, a hand raised to the nose and hastily lowered when they realized he saw. Each reaction cut Henry deeper than any blade. The charming, athletic prince he once had been seemed like someone else's memory. Walking, the simplest act of life, slowly slipped from him. 1540. He began carrying a jeweled walking stick and pretended it was for style. No one believed him. 1541. He relied heavily on it. Chairs were placed throughout the palace, so he could collapse into them. 1542. The wheelchair arrived, called anything but a wheelchair to maintain the illusion of dignity. 2 servants pushed him through the palace halls, their backs aching. But stairs were everywhere. The solution was primitive, a reinforced chair tied to ropes. 6 guards hauled him up staircases like cargo. The king trembled, eyes squeezed shut, terrified of falling. When they reached each landing, he often wept from relief. The King of England, reduced to fear of steps. By 1545, even this became impossible. A larger contraption, half sedan chair, half cage, was built. 6 men carried him everywhere. Their shoulders developed permanent indentations. Physicians treated them for chronic back injuries. But refusal meant prison. Behind the drawn curtains of his tram, Henry raged or cried, depending on the day. Privacy was gone forever. Intimacy, a secret visit, a lover's whisper, belonged to a different lifetime. Then came the cautery. The smell of burning meat in the royal bedchamber did not come from feasts. It came from the king's own legs. When infection dug too deeply, fire was the last desperate treatment. Heated iron rods glowed orange in the brazier. Henry gripped the bedposts while poppy-laced wine dulled nothing. The iron descended. His screams were inhuman. The hiss of searing flesh filled the room. Smoke curled upward. Servants froze where they stood. Some crossed themselves. Some cried silently. This was their king being saved. Again and again. Each cauterization left fresh burns that reopened, reinfected, and ensured the cycle would never end. Henry VIII was dying on his feet long before death finally claimed him. After Katherine Howard's execution, Henry VIII lived inside a body that tortured him daily. The leg ulcers that had plagued him since the 1536 jousting accident never healed. They only deepened, tunneling toward bone and spilling infection into the air around him. The treatments meant to keep him alive were indistinguishable from torture. Several times a week, the king endured setons, metal rods forced into the ulcers to tear open new channels for drainage. His screams became so familiar that the palace learned to live around them. Musicians played louder. Courtiers avoided entire wings. Everyone pretended they heard nothing. This was not a man any woman could touch. How could intimacy exist in chambers that smelled of rot and echoed with agony? But the body wasn't the only thing dying. Henry's mind was crumbling too. The prince who once debated theology with Europe's greatest scholars was gone, replaced by a volatile, paranoid tyrant who barely recognized himself. His mood could shift without warning. One moment calm, the next erupting in purple-faced fury because a servant dropped a plate. Courtiers learned to freeze in place during these storms, praying not to be noticed. Worse still was the paranoia. Henry woke at night, screaming that assassins lurked in the walls. Loyal servants rushed to find him pointing at shadows, wild-eyed, trembling. His memory fractured. He forgot conversations that happened hours earlier, then accused long-trusted men of conspiracy when their accounts didn't match his own. Modern historians see Cushing's syndrome in every symptom: extreme weight gain, mood swings, paranoia, slow-healing wounds. The trigger? Likely the same concussion that left him unconscious under a fallen warhorse in 1536. The accident had not only shattered his legs, it had damaged his brain. As his mind deteriorated, Henry grew convinced that God had turned against him. He prayed frantically in his private chapel, begging for forgiveness. His once commanding faith warped into superstition. He wore amulets, paid for endless masses, consulted mystics. Chronic pain twists the spirit. Henry lived in a perpetual fight-or-flight state with no enemy to strike except his own failing flesh. By 1543, when he set his sights on Katherine Parr, the charismatic king of Europe was gone. In his place stood a massive, rage-ridden, rotting tyrant whose world had shrunk to pain, fear, and increasing helplessness. Catherine Parr did not want to marry him. When her second husband died, she finally had freedom, and Thomas Seymour, the king's charming brother-in-law, a man she actually loved. But once Henry noticed her, everything changed. Seymour was shipped to Brussels. Catherine's family reminded her that refusing a king was suicide. And Catherine herself believed, through her deeply religious lens, that she was being called to serve God by caring for Henry and protecting his vulnerable daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Her marriage motto revealed everything: to be useful in all I do. Not to love, not to obey, to be useful. She became queen on July 12, 1543. The wedding was small, almost private. The reality awaiting her was worse than anything she imagined. There was no consummation. Henry's body made it physically impossible. His weight had passed 300 pounds. He could not stand unaided. The ulcers on his legs required constant dressing changes. The smell of decay clung to him so strongly that ambassadors left meetings to vomit. Pain ruled every hour of his life. Catherine's role was clear. She was not a wife. She was a nurse, administrator, caretaker, and political shield. She coordinated his medications, managed his moods, shielded his children, and tried to steer a king losing both sanity and strength. Intimacy? Impossible. The entire court understood. Even Henry understood. His sexuality, once the engine that destroyed marriages, churches, and kingdoms, had vanished completely. His decline accelerated. His eyesight failed rapidly. Spectacles were imported from Venice by the dozen. His signature grew shaky and illegible. A metal stamp replaced his royal hand. The first time in English history a king depended on a device to rule. The symbolism was obvious. The king was fading. By 1545, he could no longer navigate stairs. The palace built crude lifts, wooden chairs tied to ropes. 6 men hauled him upward like cargo. His fear of falling was so intense that he sometimes wept when they reached the landing. Later, a larger sedan chair was constructed, carried by 6 laborers whose bodies broke under the daily strain. Behind its curtains, Henry raged or cried or fell into despair. Privacy had evaporated. Even being moved required an audience. And then came the cauterizations. When infections spread too deeply, physicians heated iron rods until they glowed and pressed them directly into the ulcers. The sound of Henry's screams traveled through the palace like a curse. The smell of burning flesh mixed with rot was so horrific that veterans of war claimed they had never experienced worse. The procedure left him exhausted, trembling, and soaked in sweat, but within weeks, it had to be repeated. The cycle never ended. The psychological collapse followed the physical. Henry lost the ability to speak clearly. Words dissolved on his tongue. He drifted in and out of consciousness, kept barely alive by wine and poppy-based drugs. By late 1546, he spent most days in a stupor, attended by Katherine, who remained not out of love but duty and survival. January 28, 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII lay dying. The ulcers had consumed his legs entirely. Infection poisoned his blood. His organs failed one by one. Catherine Parr sat beside him, holding the swollen hand of the man who had destroyed lives, broken kingdoms, and reshaped the world. His eyes opened occasionally, unfocused, seeing nothing. Just before 2 in the morning, his breath rattled, the unmistakable sound of the dying. Katherine squeezed his hand. Whether he felt it, no one would ever know. His chest rose once more, then fell. Henry VIII was dead at 55. The king who had once been Europe's golden prince died without a mistress, without intimacy, without touch beyond medical necessity. The body that had betrayed him so completely ensured that no woman would ever share his bed again. The wolf had become carrion long before death claimed him.